We have some breaking news for you. U.S. President Donald Trump is angrily reacting once again to Ontario's anti-tariff act.
What if a single trade decision could quietly dismantle the most integrated auto industry on the planet, raise car prices for millions of American families, and trigger the deepest rupture between the United States and Canada in generations? That is no longer a hypothetical question. As the trade war escalates under renewed tariff pressure, Canada is signaling a historic shift away from automatic alignment with Washington, while the United States doubles down on America First industrial policy. Auto jobs, steel, energy, and national economic security are now directly at stake on both sides of the border. And what officials are not saying publicly may be even more alarming. Stay to the very end, because the data shows this move does not stop at the border. It ripples through supply chains, jobs, and prices inside the United States itself. The warning did not come from a protest or a leaked memo. It came in plain language, delivered publicly, and aimed at the core of North America's industrial economy. When the United States Commerce Secretary stated that there would be no free trade without tariffs and that automobile assembly belongs in the United States alone, the message was unmistakable. This was not negotiation. It was a line being drawn. For Canada, the implications were immediate. Automobile manufacturing is not a standalone industry. It anchors steel production, aluminum smelting, energy demand, transportation, and hundreds of thousands of skilled jobs. Removing assembly from Canada does not merely weaken one sector. It destabilizes an entire economic ecosystem built over more than a century. For the United States, the risk is less visible but potentially more severe. American manufacturers rely on Canadian inputs that cannot be quickly replaced. Specialized steel, aluminum, critical minerals, and cross-border components move back and forth multiple times before a single vehicle is completed. Disrupt that flow, and costs rise inside American factories first, not last. This is where the situation turns dangerous. Because once tariffs enter an integrated system, they stop behaving like leverage and start behaving like friction. And when friction builds inside a supply chain this tightly connected, something eventually breaks. What breaks first may surprise you, and the data behind it is far more unsettling than officials are admitting. The most misunderstood aspect of a trade war is where the damage first appears. It does not begin with factory closures or dramatic headlines. It begins quietly, inside pricing models, procurement contracts, and balance sheets across the United States auto industry. When tariffs are introduced into a deeply integrated supply chain linking the United States and Canada, their effect is immediate and cumulative. Automobiles assembled in the United States depend on thousands of components that cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Steel, aluminum, advanced alloys, battery inputs, and precision parts sourced from Canada are embedded in vehicles long before a consumer ever steps into a dealership. When tariffs are applied, they attach themselves to every crossing, compounding costs with each movement. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a mechanical certainty of how modern manufacturing works. Manufacturers then face a narrowing set of choices. They can absorb higher costs, which compresses margins and reduces capital available for hiring, research, and expansion. Or they can pass those costs forward. In practice, they do both. Vehicle prices rise incrementally, often without a single announcement, until the cumulative increase becomes unavoidable for buyers. For American households, particularly middle-aged and older consumers, automobiles are not discretionary purchases. They are essential assets tied to employment, healthcare access, and family responsibilities. When prices increase, buyers delay purchases, opt for used vehicles, or extend financing terms. Each of those responses slows demand. Slower demand leads to inventory buildup, reduced production schedules, and pressure on employment. This is where tariffs stop behaving like a policy tool and start behaving like a tax. Not a targeted tax on foreign competitors, but a broad internal cost borne by American consumers. Unlike income taxes or fuel taxes, this cost is invisible. It arrives in monthly payments, higher interest burdens, and reduced resale values. Over time, the cumulative effect erodes consumer confidence, particularly among households already sensitive to inflation and borrowing costs. The danger is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow constriction. A trade war fought through tariffs introduces friction into an economic system designed for speed and efficiency. The longer that friction remains, the more it reshapes behavior across the market. And once consumer demand weakens, reversing the damage becomes far more difficult than triggering it. What makes this moment especially severe is that the United States enters this phase with elevated interest rates, aging vehicle fleets, and limited room for households to absorb additional cost shocks. Tariffs do not arrive in isolation. They stack on top of existing pressures, magnifying their impact far beyond what policymakers often anticipate. While consumers feel the pressure through prices, workers feel it through instability. The United States auto sector employs millions of people directly and indirectly, spanning assembly plants, parts suppliers, logistics providers, dealerships, and financing services. This ecosystem depends on volume, predictability, and cross-border coordination with Canada. When tariffs disrupt that coordination, the first response from companies is rarely layoffs. It is caution, overtime hours are reduced, temporary contracts are not renewed, investment plans are delayed, training programs are scaled back. These changes rarely make headlines, but they are the earliest indicators of stress inside the labor market. As costs rise and demand softens, suppliers feel the strain even faster than manufacturers. Many American suppliers operate on thin margins and depend on high-volume orders tied to cross-border production schedules. When those schedules become uncertain, smaller firms face cash flow pressure. Some consolidate, others exit quietly. Each closure weakens the resilience of the broader supply chain. The feedback loop is relentless. Reduced supplier capacity raises costs further. Higher costs suppress demand. Lower demand justifies further production cuts. At no point does this process resemble a clean reshoring of jobs. Instead, it produces fragmentation and inefficiency across the North American industrial base. Crucially, many of the materials targeted indirectly by tariffs are not easily replaced domestically in the short term. Specialized steel grades, aluminum products, and critical minerals sourced from Canada are integral to both traditional vehicles and electric platforms. Attempting to substitute these inputs quickly often results in quality compromises, higher costs, or production delays. For the United States, this creates a strategic contradiction. Tariffs are intended to strengthen domestic industry, yet they weaken the very supply chains that make domestic production competitive. In a global market where manufacturers compete not just on price but on reliability and speed, even small disruptions can shift investment decisions elsewhere. Employment effects, once they surface, tend to lag policy decisions by months rather than weeks. By the time layoffs appear in official data, the underlying damage is already entrenched. That lag creates a false sense of security in the early stages of a trade war, masking its real trajectory until corrective action becomes politically and economically costly. This is why the current moment matters. The United States is not confronting a distant competitor with limited integration. It is applying tariffs to its closest industrial partner, Canada, inside a system built on shared production rather than simple trade. The consequences are internal as much as external. And here is the most unsettling reality. Once companies begin restructuring supply chains to avoid long-term tariff exposure, those changes rarely reverse quickly, even if tariffs are later reduced. Decisions made under uncertainty have long shadows. What comes next is not just economic fallout, but a strategic shift that could permanently reshape how the United States and Canada do business, and the next section reveals why that shift may already be underway. From Washington's perspective, tariffs remain a blunt but politically effective instrument. They project resolve, signal protection of domestic jobs, and align neatly with the America First narrative. In the abstract, the logic appears straightforward. Apply pressure, force production home, and claim victory. But when applied to Canada, that logic collides with economic reality. Canada is not a low-cost offshore producer. It is the United States' most integrated industrial partner. The two economies are bound by decades of shared standards, synchronized logistics, and deeply interwoven supply chains. In the auto sector alone, production planning assumes seamless cross-border movement as a baseline, not an exception. Tariffs disrupt that baseline instantly. Yet inside Washington, the political incentive structure rewards short-term signaling over long-term coordination. Tariffs are visible, their costs are delayed. This temporal gap creates room for optimism bias. Policymakers can argue that domestic capacity will expand before disruptions become severe, even though industrial investment cycles operate on timelines measured in years, not election seasons. There is also a strategic contradiction at work. The United States has spent years emphasizing supply chain resilience, nearshoring, and trusted partners. Canada sits at the center of that framework. It provides critical minerals, reliable energy, advanced materials, and regulatory alignment unmatched by most global suppliers. Undermining that relationship through tariffs weakens the very resilience Washington claims to prioritize. Internally, this tension produces mixed signals. While trade officials emphasize leverage and compliance, other branches quietly acknowledge the risks. State governments in manufacturing-heavy regions understand that export access to Canada underpins local employment. Corporate leaders recognize that replacing Canadian inputs with domestic alternatives will raise costs rather than reduce them in the near term. The result is policy incoherence. Tariffs are imposed to assert control, while exemptions and side agreements are sought to prevent internal damage. This balancing act becomes increasingly unstable as the trade war intensifies. The more tariffs are used, the harder it becomes to argue that Canada remains a trusted partner rather than a secondary player. What is rarely stated openly is that Washington's posture toward Canada sends a signal far beyond North America. If the closest ally, sharing language, values, and security commitments, can be treated as expendable in a trade war, then no partner can assume permanence. That perception matters deeply in a global economy defined by alliances as much as prices. Outside North America, the response to rising United States-Canada trade tensions has been measured but attentive. Governments and industries in Europe and Asia understand that shifts between Washington and Ottawa reshape global supply chains. When integration weakens in one region, opportunities emerge elsewhere. In Europe, Canada's existing trade frameworks offer a stable alternative. Manufacturers and investors see an opening to deepen ties with a country actively seeking diversification and industrial partnerships. Defense cooperation, advanced manufacturing, and clean energy technologies have all attracted renewed interest. For European firms, Canada represents access to North America without the unpredictability of tariff-driven policy swings. In Asia, the implications are more complex. Japan and South Korea, longtime partners of the United States in the auto sector, observe the situation closely. They recognize that fragmentation within North America increases competitive pressure globally. If costs rise inside the United States, exporters elsewhere gain relative advantage, even without changing their own strategies. China, meanwhile, draws a different lesson. Trade wars among allies weaken collective leverage. When Washington applies tariffs broadly, it normalizes the use of economic pressure in relationships that were once stable. That normalization reduces the reputational cost of similar actions by others. Over time, this erodes the rules-based system that the United States has historically championed. Canada's response amplifies these dynamics. By openly committing to diversification, industrial self-strengthening, and alternative partnerships, Ottawa signals that dependence on a single market is no longer acceptable. That message resonates globally. Other mid-sized economies facing similar pressures take note, reassessing their own exposure to dominant partners. For the United States, this creates a paradox. Tariffs aimed at reinforcing domestic strength risk, accelerating a redistribution of trust and investment away from Washington's traditional orbit. Influence is not only about market size, it is about predictability. When policy becomes volatile, even allies begin to hedge. The most consequential aspect of this shift is that it unfolds gradually. No announcement marks the moment when confidence declines. Instead, decisions accumulate quietly. Contracts are written differently. Investments are delayed or redirected. Supply chains are redesigned with optionality rather than loyalty. By the time these changes appear in trade balances and employment data, they are already embedded. And once embedded, they are difficult to unwind, even if political leadership changes. This is the broader risk embedded in the current trade war posture. It is not merely about tariffs on autos or materials. It is about how the United States is perceived as a partner in an era where economic security and geopolitical alignment are increasingly intertwined. The next section exposes how Canada is transforming this pressure into a long-term strategic pivot and why that pivot could permanently alter North America's economic balance. There is a critical threshold in every trade war when policy choices stop being reversible. That threshold is reached not when tariffs are announced, but when businesses begin redesigning their future around the assumption that tariffs will remain. Evidence suggests North America is approaching that point. For decades, the United States and Canada built industrial systems based on certainty. Investment decisions assumed predictable border access, stable rules, and long planning horizons. Automobile plants, steel facilities, energy infrastructure, and logistics networks were designed with shared efficiency in mind. Once tariffs enter that system repeatedly, certainty erodes. Companies do not wait for clarity. They adapt defensively. This adaptation carries long-term consequences. Capital that might have expanded capacity inside the United States is redirected toward flexibility rather than growth. Firms diversify suppliers, reduce cross-border exposure, and prioritize redundancy over efficiency. These strategies protect against policy risk, but they also raise costs permanently. Tariffs, in this context, cease to be temporary pressure and become embedded structural friction. For American industry, this shift undermines competitiveness. Higher production costs reduce pricing power in global markets, export volumes become harder to sustain, margins thin, limiting reinvestment. Over time, the United States risks losing not just assembly work, but leadership in advanced manufacturing segments where scale, speed, and integration matter most. Employment effects follow slowly but persistently. Jobs do not disappear overnight. They migrate. New hiring slows. Automation accelerates as firms seek to offset uncertainty with technology. Regions dependent on manufacturing feel the impact gradually, often without a single triggering event. This makes political response difficult as there is no single crisis moment to address. The most damaging outcome is not contraction, but stagnation. An economy burdened by self-imposed friction grows more slowly, innovates less aggressively, and becomes more vulnerable to external shocks. In such an environment, tariffs fail to deliver the revival they promise. Instead, they harden existing weaknesses. What makes this especially dangerous is that the cost is diffuse. No single consumer bill attributes its increase to trade policy. No single employer cites tariffs as the sole reason for caution. The damage is distributed across millions of decisions, rendering it politically invisible until it becomes economically entrenched. Once this stage is reached, reversing course becomes costly. Even if tariffs are reduced later, companies rarely rebuild abandoned structures quickly. Trust, once lost, does not return on a policy timetable. It returns on an investment timetable measured in years rather than headlines. While the United States absorbs internal friction, Canada is responding in a way that carries long-term strategic implications. Faced with repeated tariff threats and explicit signals of secondary status, Ottawa is accelerating a shift that had previously been discussed but rarely executed with urgency. This pivot is not symbolic, it is operational. Canada is investing in domestic industrial capacity, defense manufacturing, advanced materials, and energy value chains designed to serve multiple markets rather than one dominant partner. Trade diversification is no longer framed as optional insurance, it is framed as economic security. For Canada, this strategy reduces vulnerability. By broadening its trade relationships, Ottawa gains leverage and resilience. Dependence on any single market declines. Policy shocks from Washington become less destabilizing. Over time, Canada's bargaining position strengthens. Not because it confronts the United States directly, but because it relies on it less. For the United States, this shift carries a hidden cost. Influence over partners is strongest when alignment is mutual and voluntary. As Canada builds alternatives, Washington's ability to shape outcomes through pressure diminishes. Tariffs that once compelled negotiation instead accelerate disengagement. The strategic irony is difficult to ignore. In seeking to secure domestic industry, the United States risks encouraging its closest ally to develop parallel systems that operate beyond American reach. Once those systems mature, they do not dissolve easily. Supply chains, defense partnerships, and industrial ecosystems form durable networks. This is not a sudden rupture. It is a slow realignment, one that unfolds quietly through contracts signed, partnerships formed, and standards adopted. By the time it becomes visible in aggregate data, the underlying architecture has already shifted. The broader implication extends beyond Canada. Other allies observe this dynamic closely. If diversification proves successful, it sets a precedent. Mid-sized economies may conclude that reducing exposure to the United States is prudent rather than risky. In a global trade war environment, autonomy becomes a competitive advantage. For Washington, the challenge is profound. Economic leadership depends not only on market size, but on trust and predictability. When tariffs are used against allies, that trust erodes incrementally. Influence fades not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. This is the strategic point of no return. Not because cooperation becomes impossible, but because it becomes optional. And when partnership is optional, power dynamics shift fundamentally. What comes next will determine whether North America remains an integrated economic engine or fragments into competing systems that are less efficient, more costly, and harder to coordinate. The final section reveals why this moment forces a choice not just for policymakers, but for the future economic position of the United States itself, and the consequences of choosing incorrectly may last for generations. At the heart of the current trade war lies a dangerous assumption that economic pressure, applied through tariffs, will eventually force compliance without altering long-term behavior. History suggests otherwise. When pressure becomes predictable, it stops coercing and starts reshaping strategy. For the United States, the long game is no longer about winning individual negotiations. It is about whether North America remains a unified production platform or slowly fragments into parallel systems. Tariffs accelerate that fragmentation by introducing uncertainty into decisions that once relied on trust. Companies respond rationally. They reduce exposure, diversify suppliers, and redesign logistics to survive political volatility. This is where the miscalculation emerges. Tariffs may succeed in shifting a small number of assembly lines, but they simultaneously weaken the integrated advantage that made the United States competitive in the first place. Speed, scale, and coordination across borders are replaced by redundancy, higher costs, and slower response times. In a global market increasingly defined by efficiency and resilience, that trade-off is profound. More importantly, the United States risks normalizing economic coercion within allied relationships. Once that norm is established, it cannot be selectively applied. Allies adapt not out of defiance, but out of necessity, and adaptation reduces leverage permanently. Canada's response marks the true strategic twist of this story. What began as defensive posture is becoming structural redesign. Ottawa is no longer treating trade tensions as temporary disruptions. It is treating them as a permanent condition. That shift changes everything. Investment decisions now prioritize domestic capability, alternative markets, and partnerships beyond North America. Defense production, advanced materials, and energy processing are being aligned with long-term autonomy rather than short-term access. This is not withdrawal, it is insulation. For the United States, this creates an uncomfortable reality. Pressure that once guaranteed engagement now accelerates independence. Influence declines not because Canada turns hostile, but because it becomes less dependent. The relationship does not collapse. It transforms. This transformation carries a warning far beyond Canada. Other partners are watching closely. If diversification proves successful, it offers a blueprint. Reduce exposure, accept short-term adjustment costs, and gain long-term stability. In a prolonged trade war environment, that logic is compelling. The most consequential outcome may not be economic, but strategic. A world in which allies hedge against the United States is a world where leadership must be earned through reliability, not enforced through tariffs. And once that lesson is absorbed globally, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. The final question is no longer whether tariffs can pressure Canada. It is whether the United States can afford the long-term consequences of teaching its closest partners how to live without it. The conclusion exposes why this choice may define the future economic position of the United States more than any single election or trade deal. The events unfolding between the United States and Canada are not a passing dispute or a routine negotiation tactic. They mark a turning point in how economic power is exercised and how partnerships endure under pressure. Tariffs, once framed as temporary tools within a trade war, are increasingly shaping long-term behavior, investment decisions, and strategic alignment on both sides of the border. For the United States, the immediate appeal of tariffs lies in their simplicity. They promise control, protection, and visible action, but the deeper cost is less obvious. Higher prices for American consumers, quieter job losses across the supply chain, and the gradual erosion of trust among allies accumulate over time. These effects do not reverse quickly, even if policies change. Canada's response illustrates the stakes. Faced with uncertainty, it is choosing resilience over reliance, diversification over dependency. That choice does not weaken Canada's position, it strengthens it. And in doing so, it challenges the assumption that pressure alone can secure lasting advantage. This moment demands clarity rather than rhetoric. Is the current strategy a bold defense of domestic industry or a risky mistake that reshapes North America in ways the United States cannot fully control?